Hello, everybody. This is Catalyst, and I am creating my very first Catalyst Conundrum, following up our meeting on Friday about how to create more curiosity. Let's start with what actually is a conundrum. Since this is the first edition, let's establish what it is that we're going to do in this ongoing series. Specifically, a conundrum is a confusing and difficult problem or question. So what makes something actually confusing? Because a lot of the things that we tackle on their face aren't necessarily confusing. And what makes something difficult? How do we go about doing that? Purpose of doing this is to actually bring more curiosity to bear. Curiosity is what helps us solve questions. It also helps us elevate as a species. This looks delicious, doesn't it? I love almonds. I could eat that whole bowl. But did you know that most of the early species of almond trees were poisonous? Like incredibly poisonous? This is where cyanide comes from. And what happened is humanity learned how to domesticate those particular series of plants through trial and error. But think about the high risk, high reward. You could eat this and die just like that. So those are the things that we're going to be talking about. And this is why curiosity is so important. Sometimes if we challenge ourselves through the trial and error process, we actually learn. Now, nothing that we're actually doing is actually going to kill us. The difficulty, though, is we have to have the patience to keep asking why and be more curious. If not, we're going to get frustrated and quit and never actually solve the problem. Those complex problems are what we get hired to address, and that's the change that we need to be providing. So to frame this out, something all of us need to listen to and learn and over and over again is simple can be harder than complex. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean to make it simple, but it's worth it in the end because once you get there, you can move mountains. It is difficult to be simple. It is difficult to have the frame of reference. And part of the series that we're doing are phrasing questions to help develop the skills of getting things clean. So let's start with something simple, right? Nouns and verbs, they're pretty simple, right? Are they? What do you think? In a previous video, I responded back to clarity, and we think clarity is a simple word, right? It means a lot of different things, a lot of different people. But there's two forms, really, of where clarity comes from. Clarity comes from doing, clarity comes from understanding. And what's interesting is nouns are the vocabulary of understanding and verbs are the vocabulary of taking action. Now, let's bring this to life a little bit. Here are two things that are the same thing. The word hammer. But on the left, it's a noun. And if we are presented with a noun, think about all the different ways we could describe this thing. All the ways that we could describe or talk about the wood, the source of the metal, what's its metallurgy, what's the purpose, why is it tapered? We could be curious about lots of things that describe the what and understand the object. Or we can pick the thing up and start using it to hammer stuff. And obviously hammering is a skill you need to learn because those are my carpentry skills on the first couple parts. Hammer is a verb. Hammer is a noun. Hammer is both. And oftentimes we're presented with a lot of words to be able to ascertain and solve specific problems. But what happens is because of our bias, because of the silos, because of what our expectations are, all of these different things, we tend to describe the hammer rather than use it. So what I want us to do are think like cavemen. Those cave people, the first people who picked the almonds out of the tree and died, well, thank God for them because I have those delicious almonds to be able to work with. But this is what we need to think about. What is the minimum in our pilot stage? What is the minimum that we need to solve the problem. How do we understand what problem we're solving? Are we communicating clearly? Are we taking stock of all the different variables around us to be able to use it? I'm going to have other conundrums, specifically teasing out the orchestration orb. I wanted to get the first one out there to help provide feedback so that we can produce more things to help us out on Acuvia. And specifically, how do we focus on what the situation is? How do we get our thinking clean to understand the situation? Okay, part of what we're going to talk about too is scope. Scope is how we put boxes around things, or how we define what is the scope of work that we're working on, what is the scope of work that each of us are working on individually, and how do we help? So let's look at the definition of scope. When you look at scope, there are different variations. So again, the word seems simple, but is it simple? Or does understanding scope become complex and something that we need to create a conundrum that we need to be curious about? So if you look at these different definitions, a lot of people understand the word scope as the extent or area subject matter. In other words, what am I responsible for? So that's why in silos, you get a lot, especially with people who are specialists, you get a lot of, that's not my job. I'm gonna wait for somebody else to do something. When you look at the second definition, the opportunity or possible to do with or deal with something, well, you get into pontification land, theory. We could do this, we could do that. It could be this, it could be that. And there's value for that also. All of these things are legitimate. However, the scope that we're trying to apply as we problem solve is this one: assess or investigate something. We want to isolate something specific so we can go tackle. Scope is a verb for us. It's a verb, it's not a noun. There are other ways to look at scope too, from a classic consulting. So what we are doing that's different is that we're taking the word scope and we're not trying to apply it to roles. We're not trying to use it as an opportunity to talk about everything that's possible. We're talking about what's possible in vein of solving this specific complex problem that we're doing. So that's why it's really important to always go back to our foundations and make sure we're asking the right questions of, are we doing something in scope? Or are we doing something outside of scope? What does scope really mean? When you have words like clarity that are ambiguous right after you do a little bit of scratching. Okay, now to get more curious, we can find some common patterns already. Look at this word here in the verb, it's investigate. What does the word investigate make you think of? Well, for me, and hopefully for you, it should make you think about research. Research is an investigative technique. There are many ways that we can talk about research. I like to default into the scientific method. It helped create a set of enlightenment. We wouldn't be a country if it weren't for the Enlightenment, and thank God, and not being held by ridiculous beliefs of the church. So when you look at research and the definition of research, it also has a noun and a verb. The noun describes the process, so we can talk about research and all the different kinds of research, and we can get very thoughtful about the process of investigation. Or we can look at the word investigate, there's that word again, and concentrate on the word systematically. So that's interesting. How do we investigate something systematically? Again, the word is investigate. It's not solution. It's not answer. It's not solve. This word doesn't say solve systematically. It says investigate. That's what research is. So for me, having been a research director, I want to tell you a story of this in application in real life. Uh, I like to frame this out very simply. The art of doing good research is to ask the right question and follow a systematic process until the answer is revealed. Revealed is the key word. The reason that you want to do that is if you don't do that, you're going to put all your biases around it, and you might as well just offer an opinion. And, you know, everybody's got an opinions. And when you just come off with opinions, this is where clients think you sound like an asshole. And it's the truth. It's just something that happens. It's the reality of the world. But when we are curious and we have a systematic method to be curious and stage it out, the things that we produce as a result may be controversial, but we have a ground to stand on. So let me talk to you about a real life situation. At Forrester, one of the things that we were trying to get to is this idea of making the research more applicable. And we created these different playbooks, and they got all the research directors together for a meeting about how they would do it. And one of the things that was very frustrating is the people who were running the meeting were telling us basically, here's the design point and fill these things out and get your people to fill them out. But what happened was there are, I'd say half of, maybe it's a little bit less than half, but about half of the research analysts, the research directors, were curious about, let's talk about what process we're going to follow. In other words, research is a verb. However, one of the things that Forrester would do is use the word generate research, publish research. You publish your research. So when you would talk about research, it meant the actual physical product. So a report, I call them reports, but within Forrester, if you have a document that I wrote or that Brian wrote, those were called, that was all called research. I never called it research because I believe that research is a verb. Anybody can publish anything. If you don't have a clear methodology, you're just creating opinion. So what happens is there are people who really like using published research and don't want to follow process, because then they can write up their own observations so that they can be right. And as you guys know, I am in the business of trying to get it right. The process of getting it right is actually a process, and we have to talk about the process, not just doing. That's being right. So these are the challenges that of verbs and nouns present themselves, and why clarity is so important, and why each, I probably should have flipped these, but why each of these things are so important. Okay, now let's bring this to life as an example. So one of the things that Architect put together was this model here. And what he's doing, which is a fantastic process, is trying to describe the experience of the exercise about change that we went through. So what's interesting is, let's compare what the scope is and what the specific words are and whether or not they map. What's interesting is the vocabulary, and I'm sorry, I didn't finish the slides here. The vocabulary that we used, let me just change it here. Is there a difference if, how do we help our clients experience change? How do we know? The assignment was this. This is the assignment. Do we have an answer to that? No, we have not completed our inquiry. We have not completed the research. Therefore, answering the question that was listed before is not possible. So we have to go back. If we followed all these different steps, it's neat to make these observations, but do we have an answer at the end? Do we have a point of view at the end about how exactly this change happened? The answer is no. So this is what I mean by being curious, always being curious about what the focal point of what it is that we're doing. Can we communicate and experience a change better? Well, is that really the root of what we're looking at? Are we looking at how do we figure out what change happens if we changed that and focused this as being the primary focal point? Do people agree? Do we have a position or a few positions about how exactly does change happen? Did we, if you evaluate all of the people who participated, did they pay off this question? Or did they talk about what they think change is? Completely different questions. The reason exactly is in here is because it moves the word and the process of change away from a noun, which is something that we describe, into a verb, which is something that we do. And these are the things that we need to be very aware when we go off and do work. Are we building, when we do design, is the infrastructure or the architecture, are we doing these things in a way that's more action oriented, designed to drive action? Or are they more discovery or cerebral? And these are the things that we need to police ourselves. We will make things a lot more clear because at the end of the day, what's somebody going to want? A report around describing this and lots of options and let's talk about hammers? Or to say, hey, here's how you use this thing to build a building or whatever, whatever the case might be. What we need to be doing is being a lot more situationally aware and less cognitive, less cerebral, much more curious about how it's going to be used, much more curious about why it matters, much more curious about what specifically it is that's being said. What's a lot more curious about where inside the process is it that we're doing, and then a lot more conversation about what kinds of tools do we need to have so that we make it more repeatable and more clear for others. I look forward to hearing your comments. What do you think of the first Catalyst conundrum? What would you like to see better, done differently? Thank you. Have a great day.